In 1950, the median price of a house in America was $7,600. The median household income that year was about $3,300. That means the average American family could buy a house for roughly 2.3 times their annual income. Now let's jump to today. The median home price is around $400,000. The median household income is about $75,000. Do the math, and that's 5.3 times annual income. Houses haven't just gotten more expensive, they've become fundamentally unaffordable compared to what people actually earn. So what happened between 1950 and now that broke the relationship between wages and housing prices? The story starts with the world your grandparents inherited after World War II. When soldiers came home in the 1940s, there was a massive housing shortage. Millions of young families needed places to live, and the government knew that political stability depended on these veterans being able to buy homes and start their lives. So the federal government did something revolutionary. They created massive subsidies and programs to make home ownership accessible to the middle class. The FHA insured mortgages so banks would lend with lower down payments. The VA offered zero-down loans to veterans. And most importantly, the government built infrastructure, highways, water systems, electrical grids that made it cheap and easy to develop huge tracts of land on the outskirts of cities. This is how the suburbs were born. Developers like William Levitt figured out they could mass-produce houses using assembly line techniques borrowed from the auto industry. Levittown, the famous suburb in New York, sold houses for about $8,000 in 1947. These weren't mansions, they were 700, 600 square foot cookie-cutter boxes with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. But they were brand new, they had yards, and most importantly, young families could actually afford them on a single income. Between 1945 and 1965, America built housing at a staggering pace. We were adding millions of units per year, and because supply was abundant and the government was subsidizing demand, prices stayed reasonable relative to incomes. But then something shifted in the 1970s and it changed everything. Zoning laws got way more restrictive. Here's what happened. The suburbs that exploded in the 1950s and 60s were initially wide open for development. But once people moved in and established their communities, they didn't want more growth. They'd gotten theirs, and now they wanted to protect their property values and keep their neighborhoods exactly as they were. So communities across America started passing strict zoning laws that made it incredibly difficult to build new housing. They required huge minimum lot sizes, banned multifamily homes, created endless environmental review processes, and gave neighbors the power to block new construction. This is called exclusionary zoning, and it's one of the biggest reasons housing costs exploded.
Let's be clear about what these zoning laws actually do. When you make it illegal to build apartments or townhouses in a neighborhood and require every lot to be at least half an acre with only single-family homes, you artificially restrict the supply of housing. And when supply is restricted, but demand keeps growing because people keep having kids and moving to cities for jobs, prices go up. It's basic economics. But here's the darker truth. A lot of these zoning laws weren't just about preserving neighborhood character. They were about keeping certain people out. Wealthy communities used zoning as a legal tool to maintain racial and economic segregation. If you make it illegal to build affordable housing, you ensure that only wealthy people can live there. The result is that cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston have some of the most restrictive zoning in the country, and, surprise, they also have some of the most expensive housing. Now let's talk about what happened to wages, because housing didn't get expensive in a vacuum. Incomes also stagnated. In the 1950s and 60s, wages grew consistently alongside productivity. When American workers became more efficient and companies made more profit, workers saw that reflected in their paychecks. But starting in the 1970s, that relationship broke. Productivity kept going up, but wages flatlined. A worker today produces way more value per hour than a worker in 1970, but their inflation-adjusted wages have barely budged. Meanwhile, the costs of housing, healthcare, and education all skyrocketed. So you have this double squeeze. Houses are getting more expensive, while your ability to afford them isn't improving at nearly the same rate. There's also a massive shift in what houses actually are. The average new home built in 1950 was about 950 square feet. Today, the average new home is about 2,500 square feet. Houses got bigger, fancier, and loaded with features that didn't exist in 1950. Central air conditioning, granite countertops, walk-in closets, three-car garages. Some people argue this explains the price increase. You're not comparing apples to apples because modern houses are way nicer. And there's some truth to that. But here's the problem. Even when you control for size and try to buy a modest starter home, they're still wildly unaffordable in most cities. The market isn't building 950 square foot houses anymore because zoning laws and building codes make small homes financially unviable for developers. So even if you wanted to buy a modest house like your grandparents had, you literally can't. They're not being built. Let's talk about 2008, because the housing crash was supposed to make homes more affordable, but it actually made things worse in the long run. Leading up to 2008, housing prices had been inflating into a massive bubble fueled by reckless lending. Banks were giving mortgages to anyone with a pulse. People were buying houses they couldn't afford with loans that had exploding interest rates. When the bubble popped, millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure and housing prices crashed. You'd think this would be the Great Reset that made housing affordable again, right? Wrong. What actually happened is that big investment firms swooped in and bought up hundreds of thousands of foreclosed homes at discount prices. Companies like Blackstone became massive landlords, turning single-family homes into rental properties. So instead of those homes going to new families trying to build wealth, they went to Wall Street firms that now rent them back to the same people who lost their homes.
And here's where it gets even more frustrating. After 2008, home building in America basically collapsed. Developers went bankrupt, construction workers left the industry, and banks became terrified of lending for new construction. Between 2008 and 2015, America built housing at the slowest pace since World War II. We had massive demand, millennials were becoming adults and starting families, but supply wasn't keeping up. And remember those restrictive zoning laws we talked about? They made it even harder to ramp construction back up. So we entered the 2020s with a massive housing shortage. Estimates suggest we're short anywhere from 3 to 7 million housing units nationally. When you don't have enough houses for the number of people who want to buy them, prices go insane. Then COVID hit and made everything exponentially worse. Interest rates dropped to historic lows, which sounds good until you realize what it actually did. It made monthly mortgage payments cheaper, which meant people could afford to bid higher prices for houses. So home prices shot up 30 to 40% in many markets between 2020 and 2022. At the same time, remote work meant people weren't tied to expensive cities anymore, so they flooded into suburbs and smaller towns, driving up prices in places that used to be affordable. And investors, both big firms and small landlords, started buying houses as inflation hedges, competing directly with regular families. Some markets saw investors buying 20 to 30% of available homes. If you were a first-time buyer trying to compete with an investment firm offering all cash, you had no chance. Let's also talk about the financialization of housing, because this is a huge part of why prices can't come down. In 1950, a house was primarily a place to live. Yes, it was an asset and it built wealth, but it wasn't treated like a stock. Today, housing is seen as an investment vehicle first and a home second. Homeowners vote for policies that keep their property values high because their net worth is tied up in their house. Politicians are terrified of doing anything that might lower home prices because homeowners vote in large numbers and they don't want to lose wealth. So you have this perverse incentive where everyone who already owns a home has a financial interest in keeping prices high, even though that destroys affordability for the next generation. It's a massive intergenerational wealth transfer, where boomers and Gen X locked in cheap houses, and now millennials and Gen Z are priced out.
There's also the reality that housing costs vary wildly depending on where you live, and that's not an accident. It's the result of local policy choices. In cities like Houston or Atlanta, where zoning is more relaxed and there's plenty of land to build on, housing is relatively affordable. The median home in Houston is around $300,000. Meanwhile, in San Francisco or Los Angeles, where zoning is incredibly restrictive and every new project gets fought in court for years, the median home is over $1 million. These aren't different planets, they're different policy environments. The expensive cities chose to restrict supply, and now they're dealing with the consequences: homelessness, long commutes, workers leaving for cheaper states. So where does this leave us? Your grandparents bought a house for 2.3 times their income. You're looking at 5.3 times your income, and in expensive cities, it's more like 10 times your income. This isn't sustainable, and it's not normal. Other countries figured this out. In Japan, they have flexible zoning that allows housing to be built where it's needed, and Tokyo actually has affordable housing despite being one of the biggest cities in the world. In Germany, they have strong renter protections and view housing as a right, not just an investment. These aren't utopias, but they show that the American system isn't the only way to do things. The $7,000 house isn't coming back. That world is gone. But the $400,000 house we have now isn't the result of natural market forces. It's the result of specific zoning decisions, wage stagnation, financial crashes, and a political system that prioritizes homeowners over renters. And if you think housing's bad, wait until you see what happened to the price of water. Yeah, water. The stuff that used to be free. There's a wild story involving a French company, some brilliant marketing, and how we all got convinced to pay $2 for a bottle of tap water. That's the next video, and it'll change how you look at every bottle of Dasani or Fiji you've ever bought. If this video made you rethink the whole just buy a house advice, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the water bottle episode. And drop a comment telling me what price you want explained next. Healthcare, weddings, cars, whatever. Every price has a story. I'll see you in the next one.